The most dangerous person in the room is not always the one who attacks you. Sometimes, it is the one who stays calm while watching you lose control. Ethan Walker learned this in the quietest way possible. There was no shouting, no public humiliation, no obvious threat. Just Claire Whitman sitting across the conference table, looking at him with a kind of cold patience that made him feel smaller every second. She did not need to raise her voice. She only had to pause before answering. She only had to glance away when he was speaking. She only had to make him feel that his words were something she had already measured and dismissed. And that was the part that hurt most. Not what she said, but what her silence made him believe about himself. Ethan thought the pain came from Claire, but the real wound was older. It was the part of him that still needed someone like her to confirm his value. Maybe you know that feeling. Someone ignores your message, and suddenly your peace disappears. Someone speaks to you with a slightly colder tone, and your mind starts building a courtroom against yourself. Someone acts unimpressed, and you begin explaining, defending, proving, chasing. You tell yourself you are just trying to be understood. But deep down, something darker is happening. You are handing another person the remote control to your nervous system. This is the hidden law Ethan did not understand. The person who can make you react can make you reveal where you are still not free. Claire did not control him with force. She controlled him with uncertainty. She knew that if she gave him less warmth, he would work harder. If she withheld approval, he would start performing. If she stayed silent long enough, he would rush in to fill the space with explanations. That is how emotional power is often tested in real life. Not through dramatic confrontations, but through small moments that expose whether you belong to yourself. A delayed reply, a dismissive look, a compliment taken back, a conversation where you suddenly feel like you are auditioning for basic respect. Ethan had built a life that looked stable from the outside. He was educated, polite, capable, the kind of man people described as reliable. But Claire saw something he did not want to admit. His confidence depended too much on the emotional temperature of the room. When people approved of him, he felt strong. When they questioned him, he became restless. When they ignored him, he became desperate to be seen. That is not strength. That is emotional dependency wearing professional clothes. And this is where many people lose their inner power. They think being unbreakable means never feeling hurt. It does not. It means feeling the hit without letting it choose your behavior. It means noticing the sting, the anger, the shame, the need to explain, and still not becoming a puppet for it. Ethan's first mistake was believing every emotional trigger required an immediate response. Claire leaned back, gave him that faint, unreadable smile, and said, "Are you sure that is the best you can do?" A simple sentence. Quiet. Almost harmless. But inside Ethan, something snapped awake. His chest tightened. His thoughts sped up. He wanted to defend his work, defend his intelligence, defend the version of himself he needed her to respect. And in that moment, Claire had already won the first battle. Not because she was more powerful, but because Ethan had left his center. The art of becoming emotionally unbreakable begins here. Realizing that not every reaction inside you deserves to become an action outside you. The second mistake Ethan made was more subtle. He believed Claire's coldness was something he had to solve. That is where the trap begins for most people. Someone changes their tone, pulls back affection, delays a response, gives you less eye contact, and suddenly your mind treats their distance like an emergency. You stop asking, "Is this person being fair to me?" and start asking, "What did I do wrong?" That shift is the quiet surrender of power. Claire understood this without ever saying it. She knew Ethan was not just responding to her words. He was responding to the meaning he attached to her words. When she looked unimpressed, he translated it as failure. When she paused, he translated it as rejection. When she withheld warmth, he translated it as proof that he had to earn his place again. This is the psychological game many people miss because it does not look like a game. It looks like a manager who only praises you when you overwork. It looks like a partner who becomes distant whenever you set a boundary. It looks like a parent who says, "I guess you are too busy for your family now," when you finally choose yourself. It looks like a friend who makes a joke at your expense, then calls you sensitive when you do not laugh. In American workplaces, it can happen under fluorescent lights and polite language. A supervisor says, "Interesting choice," and suddenly an employee spends the whole night rewriting a project that was already good enough. A coworker leaves someone out of a lunch invitation, and that person starts trying harder to be liked by people who were never truly loyal. In relationships, it happens when someone gives affection like a reward and silence like punishment. They do not have to say, "I control you." They only need to train you to panic when their approval disappears. In families, it can be even harder to see because guilt often wears the mask of love. A father withdraws warmth when his son disagrees. A mother turns quiet when her daughter says no. A sibling brings up old mistakes just when you begin to feel confident. And because these patterns are familiar, people mistake them for normal. Ethan was beginning to see this. Sitting across from Claire, he realized she had not asked a real question. "Are you sure that is the best you can do?" Was not a request for improvement. It was a test of emotional ownership. Would he stay centered, or would he collapse into performance? Would he respond from clarity, or from the old fear of being judged? The room became very still. His first impulse was to talk, to explain the research, to prove how much effort he had put in, to make her understand that he was not careless, not weak, not average. But underneath that impulse was the real confession. He still believed his worth needed a witness. That is the uncomfortable truth. Most people are not controlled by insults. They are controlled by the fear that the insult might be true. Claire's power over Ethan came from finding the insecurity he had not disciplined yet. And once someone finds that door, they do not need to break in. They only need to knock at the right time. Emotional strength begins when you stop treating every knock as a command to open. Ethan did not lose control all at once. He lost it in the small space between feeling something and needing to prove something. That space is where most people are defeated. Claire did not need to overpower him. She only needed to make him hurry. A hurried man reveals fear. A hurried woman reveals dependence. A hurried person says more than they mean, gives more than they should, and hands over information that should have stayed private. Ethan leaned forward before he realized it. His voice became faster. His hands moved more than usual. He began explaining every decision behind the project, every late night, every problem he had solved, every reason Claire should not misunderstand him. And the more he explained, the less powerful he became. This is one of the cruelest laws of social psychology. When you explain from insecurity, people do not hear clarity. They smell need. They sense that you are begging them to see you correctly. And once they sense that, the entire balance changes. Claire's face did not move much, but her silence grew heavier. It was as if she knew the longer she stayed unreadable, the more Ethan would empty himself onto the table. That is what over-explaining does. It turns your inner world into evidence for someone who never earned the right to judge it. You think you are protecting your reputation, but you are actually giving another person a map of your pressure points. Ethan's deeper mistake was not that he cared. Caring was not the weakness. The weakness was that he became too available to anyone who made him feel uncertain. A colder email from Claire, and he answered within minutes. A vague criticism, and he stayed late to repair an image she had damaged with one sentence. A withheld compliment, and he began chasing approval like a starving man chasing warmth through a locked door. Maybe you have done this too. You get one dry text from someone you care about, and suddenly you send 3 more messages to fix a problem they never clearly named. A manager questions your judgment, and instead of calmly asking for specifics, you start defending your entire character. A friend pulls away, and you become more available, more agreeable, more careful, as if abandoning yourself will make them return. This is how people use emotion against you without appearing cruel. They create tension, and you rush to relieve it. They create distance, and you rush to close it. They create doubt, and you rush to prove. But every time you rush, you teach them something dangerous. Pressure works on you. And Ethan, without realizing it, kept answering the test instead of seeing the test. That is the part that should make you uneasy. Because this does not only happen in boardrooms. It happens when a partner says, "I am fine," in a tone that clearly means they are not, then watches how hard you work to pull the truth out of them. It happens when a boss gives vague criticism instead of clear feedback, and you spend the weekend trying to repair something they never defined. It happens when a friend makes you feel replaceable, then enjoys how quickly you become available again. The power is not always in what they do. Sometimes the power is in what they make you do next. Claire's pressure worked because Ethan treated discomfort like danger. He did not know how to let a tense moment breathe. He believed silence meant failure, distance meant rejection, and uncertainty meant he had to perform. So when Claire said, "I am not convinced," He immediately tried to become more convincing. When she said, "Maybe someone else should take the lead next time," he felt his chest tighten and his voice sharpen. That was the exact moment his position weakened. Not because he disagreed, but because his disagreement came with panic. People can feel that. They may not describe it in psychological language, but they sense when your words are carrying fear. They sense when your confidence is asking for permission. And once they sense that, they stop responding only to your argument. They start responding to your instability. This is why emotional control is not about looking cold. It is about protecting your position from being hijacked by your nervous system. Claire was not always wrong. Some of her questions were valid. Some of Ethan's work could be improved. That is what made the situation real. Pressure is not always abuse. Criticism is not always manipulation. Sometimes people challenge you because the work matters. But the deeper test remains the same. Can you receive pressure without handing over your center? Ethan was beginning to understand that Claire's opinion was not the enemy. His dependence on her approval was. Her silence was not the prison. His need to escape it immediately was. The room had not changed. Claire had not softened. But something in Ethan began to slow down. For the first time, he noticed the urge to defend himself before obeying it. And in that small pause, he touched the first edge of real power. Then the shift happened so quietly that Ethan almost missed it. Claire was still across from him, still composed, still impossible to read. The conference room was the same. The pressure was the same. But for the first time, Ethan stopped asking why she did not respect him and started asking a more dangerous question. What had he been teaching her to expect from him? That question cut deeper than her criticism. Because the truth was not simple. It was not that Claire had all the power and Ethan had none. It was that Ethan had been training the room, meeting after meeting, email after email, apology after apology, to believe that pressure would make him shrink, explain, overwork, and seek permission to exist. Every time he answered too quickly, he taught people his time had no gate. Every time he defended himself against a vague comment, he taught them they did not need evidence to unsettle him. Every time he smiled through disrespect because he wanted to seem easygoing, he taught them his boundaries were negotiable. This is the twist most people hate because it removes the comfort of blaming everyone else. Sometimes people treat you badly because they are careless, insecure, or manipulative. But sometimes they continue because your reactions have shown them there is no cost. In a workplace, if you always accept last-minute requests without question, people may begin to see your evenings as available property. In a relationship, if you reward distance with desperation, someone may learn that pulling away makes you chase. In a family, if guilt always makes you surrender, relatives may stop asking and start pressing the exact button that works. This does not mean you caused their behavior. It means your pattern may have given their behavior a place to land. Ethan saw flashes of it now. The late nights he never pushed back on. The meetings where he apologized before anyone accused him. The moments Claire dismissed him and he compensated by becoming even more useful. He had confused cooperation with self-erasure. He had confused patience with silent permission. He had confused being respected with being needed. And being needed is not the same as being valued. Sometimes people need the person they also take for granted. Claire had not invented Ethan's lack of boundaries. She had only found them. That realization did not make him angry. It made him still. Because if he had taught people one version of him, he could begin teaching another. Not through speeches. Not through dramatic announcements. Not by becoming harsh or cold. But through repeated signals that his peace, time, and dignity were no longer open for casual use. Emotional strength is built through new evidence. You show people how to treat you by what you allow, what you interrupt, what you stop rewarding, and what you calmly refuse to chase. Ethan looked at Claire and understood something he should have learned years earlier. Respect rarely arrives after a perfect explanation. More often, it begins when your behavior stops negotiating with disrespect. The first thing Ethan changed was not what he said. It was how quickly he allowed himself to be pulled. Claire waited for him to fill the silence. But this time he did not rush into it. He let the pause exist. Not as punishment. Not as a game. As protection. Controlled silence is not the same as cold withdrawal. It is the space where you stop letting another person's pressure choose your next move. Ethan breathed once, slowly, and allowed Claire's words to settle before answering. That small delay changed the room. Not dramatically. Not like a movie. But enough. Because people are used to emotional reflexes. They expect the anxious person to explain, the guilty person to apologize, the insecure person to prove. When you stop reacting on command, the old pattern loses its grip. Ethan looked at Claire and said, "I will review the specific points that need improvement. Send them to me in writing." That was a cold boundary. Not rude, not emotional, just clear. A boundary does not need anger to be real. In fact, the strongest boundaries are often quiet. They do not beg to be understood. They simply define what will and will not continue. Ethan did not explain why her tone bothered him. He did not defend his effort. He did not list every sacrifice he had made. He stopped giving speeches to someone who had not asked in good faith. That is another technique most people learn too late. Stop explaining your value to someone who benefits from questioning it. Explanation is useful when there is mutual respect. But when someone keeps using vagueness to keep you unstable, too much explanation becomes self-abandonment. Ethan also began watching behavior instead of trusting polished words. Claire could say she wanted excellence, but did her feedback create clarity or confusion? She could say she respected the team, but did her actions make people stronger or more anxious? In a workplace, relationship, or family, words are often the costume. Patterns are the truth. The person who says they care but repeatedly makes you feel small is telling you something through behavior. The person who apologizes but repeats the same harm is giving you data. The person who praises your boundaries in public but punishes them in private is revealing the real agreement they want. Ethan stopped arguing with tone and started tracking patterns. That kept him from being hypnotized by single moments. One kind sentence did not erase a month of pressure. One tense meeting did not prove Claire was evil. He held the frame. And holding the frame means you decide what reality you are operating from. Ethan's new frame was simple. I am open to feedback, but I will not perform for approval. I can improve my work, but I will not surrender my nervous system. I can respect Claire's role, but I will not make her mood my master. This is not manipulation. It is self-possession. You are not trying to control the other person. You are refusing to let their instability, silence, charm, or criticism control you. That is the difference between dark psychology used as a weapon and psychology used as a shield. One seeks dominance. The other restores dignity. Claire still had authority. She still had influence. But Ethan had recovered something more important than the perfect answer. He had recovered the distance between stimulus and surrender. The change in Ethan did not announce itself. It arrived in the small places where he used to betray himself. A message from Claire came in at 8:47 p.m., short and vague. We may need to revisit your section. A week earlier, Ethan would have replied in 3 minutes, asking what was wrong, offering to revise it immediately, trying to sound calm while his chest tightened. This time, he read it once, placed the phone face down, and returned to his evening. Not because he did not care, because urgency created by someone else was no longer automatically his emergency. The next morning, he answered with one sentence. Send the specific changes you want reviewed, and I will look at them during work hours. No apology. No panic. No emotional decoration. Claire noticed. People always notice when the old button stops working. At the next meeting, she tried the same familiar pressure. A pause after his update. A measured glance. A quiet, I am not sure that is enough. Ethan felt the old heat rise, but he did not obey it. He let silence stand between them like a closed door. Then he said, which part needs more support? That was all. The room shifted. Not loudly, but socially. A few people looked up. One coworker, Mark, who had watched Ethan over-explain for months, stopped typing. Because Ethan had become harder to read. Not fake. Not arrogant. Just less available for emotional handling. And there is a strange power in that. When people can no longer predict that guilt will make you bend, that criticism will make you ramble, that distance will make you chase, they begin to reassess you. Your silence becomes information. Your slowness becomes weight. Your calm becomes a boundary they can feel before you name it. Even Claire adjusted. She still challenged him, but her questions became more specific. Her tone became more careful. Not because Ethan forced her to respect him, but because he stopped rewarding the version of her behavior that fed on his instability. Outside the office, the same shift followed him. A friend who used to send last-minute invitations and expect Ethan to rearrange his life heard. I cannot. Make that work tonight. No long excuse. No guilty paragraph. In his family, when his mother made a small comment meant to pull him into shame, he did not defend his entire adulthood. He simply said, "I hear you," and changed the subject. In dating, he stopped chasing warmth that came and disappeared like a trick light. He watched consistency. He watched effort. He watched whether peace grew around a person or disappeared because of them. This is where mystery is born. Not from pretending to be unreachable, but from no longer being emotionally predictable to people who used to use your reactions as a map. Ethan became quieter, but more present. Less eager, but more grounded. Less expressive in the moments that used to expose him, but more honest where trust actually existed. That kind of silence creates attraction because it suggests depth. It tells the world there is more happening inside you than what you are willing to spill for approval. And for the first time, Claire could not tell whether Ethan was afraid of her judgment. That was the moment he began to feel dangerous in the only way that matters. Not dangerous to others, but dangerous to every pattern that once controlled him. Claire waited until there were other people in the room. That was the real test. Pressure feels different when it has witnesses. In private, a person can stay calm and tell themselves they are growing. But in public, when status is on the table, when faces turn toward you, when one sentence can make you feel exposed, the old self often comes back begging to survive. Ethan felt it before Claire even spoke. The meeting had moved into the final review, and his section was being discussed again. Claire looked down at the report, then let a silence stretch just long enough for everyone to notice. It was not dramatic. It was worse. It was ordinary. The kind of ordinary silence that makes a person start confessing crimes they never committed. Then she said, "I just wonder if Ethan is comfortable owning this level of risk." A month earlier, that sentence would have opened him like a wound. He would have rushed in, explained his competence, defended the numbers, softened his tone, and tried to make everyone feel safe with him again. But this time, Ethan did not move toward the bait. He looked at the report. He looked at Claire. Then he looked at the room. Slowly, calmly, as if he had all the time in the world. That was the first sign of power. He did not answer from injury. Claire added, "Because confidence is easy when nobody questions the work." A few people shifted in their chairs. Mark glanced at Ethan, expecting the familiar flood of explanation. But nothing came. Not immediately. Ethan let the silence return to Claire instead of rescuing her from it. That is the moment most people never understand. Silence only traps you when you are afraid of it. If you stop rushing to fill it, it begins to expose the person who created it. Claire's comment hung in the air without Ethan feeding it panic. Then he said, "The risk is documented on page 6. The mitigation plan is on page 8. If there is a specific gap, name it and I will address it." No heat, no apology, no performance. The room changed. It was almost invisible, but everyone felt it. Claire had offered pressure, and Ethan had returned structure. She had offered implication, and he had asked for specifics. She had tried to make the issue emotional, and he made it measurable. That is how power transfers. Not through domination, through frame. The person who defines the frame defines the interaction. Claire's frame was doubt, social pressure, and emotional discomfort. Ethan's frame was clarity, evidence, and boundaries. And for the first time, her silence did not make him smaller. It made her tactic visible. Claire looked back at the report. Her expression stayed composed, but something in her timing shifted. She had expected defensiveness. She had prepared for it. Without it, there was nothing to push against. Ethan could feel the old fear still moving somewhere inside him, but it no longer had the steering wheel. That was the difference. Emotional strength is not the absence of a storm. It is the moment the storm realizes it is no longer in charge of your hands, your mouth, or your choices. And in that room, under polite lights and quiet judgment, Ethan did something more powerful than winning an argument. He stopped auditioning for respect. Ethan did not become unbreakable because Claire changed. He became unbreakable because he stopped making her reaction the mirror of his worth. That was the identity shift. Before, he walked into every room quietly asking the same question. Do they approve of me? After that meeting, the question changed. Am I acting from self-respect? That difference seems small until you live it. One question makes you perform. The other makes you steady. One turns every cold look into a crisis. The other lets people have their moods without becoming your master. Ethan still cared about doing good work. He still listened to feedback. He still felt pressure, but he no longer treated discomfort as proof that he was losing value. Claire could pause. She could doubt. She could withhold praise. And Ethan could remain Ethan. That is what real mental strength looks like in ordinary life. Not a dramatic transformation. Not a cold personality. A quiet refusal to abandon yourself when someone else becomes difficult to please. In the weeks that followed, people noticed less of his anxiety and more of his presence. He spoke slower. He explained less. He chose his words like they belonged to him. And slowly, the room adjusted to the new version of him. Because the world studies your relationship with yourself before it decides how far it can go with you. When Ethan stopped reacting like someone who needed approval, the world started treating him like someone who had value. And this is where Ethan's story stops being only about Ethan. Because in work, love, family, and friendship, people often do not test what you say. They test what you allow. They listen to your words, but they study your boundaries. You can say you respect yourself, but if guilt makes you surrender every time, they learn guilt is the key. You can say you are busy, but if one cold message makes you drop everything, they learn distance controls your schedule. You can say you want honesty, but if you keep rewarding half-truths with access to your heart, they learn they do not need to be clear to stay close. This is the uncomfortable law. People may forget your explanations, but they remember what worked on you. In the office, they remember whether last-minute pressure makes you sacrifice your peace. In love, they remember whether silence makes you chase. In family, they remember whether shame makes you obey. Among friends, they remember whether exclusion makes you beg for your place back. That does not mean everyone is cruel. It means humans learn patterns. And if your pattern is self-abandonment, even ordinary people may begin to treat your boundaries like suggestions. Emotional strength begins when your words and behavior finally match. You stop saying, "I deserve respect," while staying available for disrespect. You stop explaining your pain to people who keep benefiting from it. You stop trying to convince others you have limits, and you start living as if those limits are real. Because the moment your boundary no longer needs their approval, it becomes power. This is the warning most people skip because power can become addictive. Once you learn how reactions work, how silence creates pressure, how distance changes desire, and how insecurity makes people predictable, a dangerous temptation appears. You may start thinking the goal is to control others. It is not. Dark psychology is not meant to turn you into the person who plays with someone's nervous system. It is meant to make sure you stop being the one whose nervous system can be played with. There is a difference between real power and toxic control. Toxic control tries to make people smaller so you can feel bigger. Real power makes you steady enough that you do not need to make anyone smaller at all. Toxic control uses silence to punish. Real power uses silence to think. Toxic control withholds affection to create panic. Real power steps back when respect is missing. Toxic control studies weakness to exploit it. Real power studies patterns to protect your peace. Ethan understood this when he looked at Claire differently. He did not want to become her opposite weapon. He wanted to become unavailable to the game. That is the line. If your calm is designed to hurt someone, it is manipulation. If your calm is designed to stop someone from hurting you, it is self-mastery. The goal is not to become cold, cruel, or unreadable to everyone. The goal is to become unreadable to people who only know how to reach you through fear, guilt, and emotional pressure. True strength does not need to dominate the room. It only needs to stop surrendering the self. By then, Ethan had become difficult to move. Not emotionless, not empty, just no longer open to every hand that reached for his reactions. Claire could still speak sharply, but her words no longer entered him unguarded. A coworker could doubt him, but doubt no longer forced him into performance. Someone could misread him, dislike him, or withhold approval, and Ethan did not rush to correct the story. He had learned that not every version of you living in someone else's mind needs to be repaired. He spoke less, but when he spoke, people listened longer. He watched more, and because he watched more, he saw what he used to miss. Who interrupted when they felt threatened, who praised only when they wanted something, who became cold when they lost control, who respected boundaries without needing to be educated. This was the unreadable state, not a mask of superiority, but a discipline of access. Ethan no longer handed out his fear, anger, hope, or pain to anyone curious enough to provoke it. His real emotions still existed, but they belonged to him first. And because he stopped begging for respect, something strange happened. Respect no longer felt like something he had to chase. It became the quiet atmosphere around a man who had finally stopped abandoning himself. In the end, Claire did not disappear from Ethan's life. The world rarely removes every person who tests you. Some people stay. Some pressures return. Some rooms still become cold when you stop performing for warmth. But Ethan was no longer the same man inside those rooms. He had stopped confusing emotional discomfort with danger. He had stopped mistaking approval for identity. He had stopped treating every silence like a verdict and every criticism like a wound that needed immediate repair. Claire could still challenge him, but she could no longer summon the old version of him on command. That version had lived. For permission, rushed toward judgment, and handed his piece to whoever looked unimpressed. The new Ethan moved differently, quietly, deliberately, with the weight of someone who knew his value did not rise or fall with another person's mood. And that is the final lesson. You do not become unbreakable by hardening your heart. You become unbreakable by no longer abandoning yourself under pressure. You still feel, you still care, you still listen, but you stop surrendering the steering wheel of your inner world. Because when you finally see the game, you are no longer the pawn.